In this session, we will look at climate change through the lens of political ecology. In the previous session, we discussed how humans shape the environment around them, and also how environmental changes have consequences back onto society as well. In that sense, human-nature relations are co-produced. Now, this also has implications for the way that we might think about environmental hazards like flooding. Flooding is often labeled as a natural disaster due to large amounts of water, but in fact, if we look carefully, we can see a range of human decisions that shape the risks associated with the risks associated with flooding, and perhaps even the existence of flooding itself as a hazard. For example, decisions that are taken in urban planning, or decisions that are taken in water management that relates to the construction and operation of water management dams. Also, in the context of climate change, we can see that these hazards are becoming increasingly prevalent and severe, and climate change itself is a consequence of many previous human decisions, as well as obviously many decisions still to come. Political ecology also pays much attention to the issue of environmental justice. So in the context of hazards, it raises the question whether everybody is equally vulnerable to a particular hazard. Are there, for example, particular age groups that are more vulnerable? Or are there gendered dimensions to the risks that are created? How does ethnicity, citizenship, economic status, and so on shape the vulnerability that different groups will face? Overall, what we can see is that when we look at climate change and natural disaster through a political ecology lens, we actually need to see the social or environmental or climate justice dimensions of the way that we think about the creation of a hazard and the risks that are associated with it. One example of a model that reveals the human decision-related dimensions of the creation of a disaster is the pressure and release model by Ben Wisner and his colleagues. So in this model, the risk of disaster is understood to be the product of hazard and vulnerability interacting together. So a hazard, in the case of this model, is understood to be an environmental phenomenon such as flooding or an earthquake or a landslide or drought. I think in addition to this, from a political ecology lens, the creation of those hazards themselves would also be seen in part as the product of human decisions. Then, in terms of the vulnerability of particular groups to that hazard, Wisner's model sees a progression of vulnerability from unsafe conditions to the underpinning dynamic pressures to the underpinning root causes of those dynamic pressures. So in terms of unsafe conditions, this includes, for example, risks or vulnerabilities associated with the physical environment, such as being in dangerous locations or where building and infrastructure is relatively unprotected due to its design. It could also relate to the local economy, where particular livelihoods might be at risk from the impacts of a hazard. It could also reflect social relations in society that place particular societal groups at risk from the hazard. Underpinning those unsafe conditions are dynamic pressures, which might include, for example, a lack of local institutions designed to address the hazards, or a lack of their training, or a lack of appropriate skills, or a lack of investment to protect from hazard. It could also reflect what Wisner refers to as macro forces, such as changing demographies of the population, or processes of rapid and unplanned urbanization. Behind those dynamic pressures, if we look even deeper, then we would see certain root causes that we could ask questions of. So these include the power relations in society and the types of political and economic structures that are in place, as well as the allocation of various types of resources that might be made available or not available to different groups in society. So overall, this model draws attention to how what might seemingly appear to be a natural disaster like flooding actually reveals that there are various human decisions and societal structures in place that create the likelihood of risks and the distribution of those risks between different groups in society. Now we will turn to some of the responses to climate change that have been developed first under the Kyoto Protocol and more recently with the Paris Agreement. So one strategy is what is broadly referred to as climate change mitigation. So mitigation refers to the policies and practices that aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, with the intention being to therefore slow or eventually halt anthropogenically driven climate change. So there have been a range of different strategies towards mitigation. One strategy utilizes decarbonization technologies and techniques. For example, in power generation, urging a transition from the use of fossil fuels to renewable energy generation such as hydropower or solar electricity. Another strategy for mitigation might be for redesigning urban areas to improve their energy efficiency. There are also negative emission technologies that actually try and remove the released carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So this includes, for example, afforestation and reforestation projects, as well as wetland construction and reconstruction. Lastly, there are proposals to have very large-scale interventions, what has been referred to as geoengineering, that is intended to, for example, rebalance the Earth's radiation balance. In other words, to reflect more energy back to the sun. Many of these technologies are being discussed, although they haven't been deployed at large scale to date. Looking at the approaches to climate change mitigation that I've just outlined in the previous slide through the lens of political ecology, we would want to ask a range of questions. For example, for a particular mitigation project or plan, how are access to resources changed due to that mitigation approach? And what would be the impact on existing livelihoods in that area due to the mitigation approach? So for example, hydropower dams have been claimed by the industry as being a technology to help deal with climate change. But we also know from a large amount of research that hydropower dams are associated with a lot of ecosystem degradation, as well as forced displacement during the project's construction and due to the reservoirs that are created. So this would be an example of how a climate change mitigation strategy actually has other consequences for local populations that may be not consistent with sustainable development, even if it claims to be working towards climate change mitigation. Other examples might relate to the way that the reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation initiatives have created consequences for communities who depend on forest resources. So this has led to a number of iterations of this type of initiative, with REDD+ followed by REDD+ followed by REDD++. If we think about this through the lens of environmental justice, then it's not just a question of the distribution of harms, but also a procedural justice dimension, namely whose voices and interests are dominant in these decision-making processes and whose are marginalized. And this becomes significant because if we think that if we recognize that there are many different approaches towards climate change mitigation, then there might be a politics of projects that emerge where certain solutions become more visible and more privileged and others are downplayed. Another lens or another aspect that political ecology has emphasized is the way in which some approaches to climate change mitigation have also enabled resource commodification. The most visible example of this is the creation of carbon trade schemes under the Kyoto Protocol and various other subsequent clean development mechanism markets that have been created. So essentially, before the Kyoto Protocol, a market for carbon did not exist. And towards the end of the Kyoto Protocol, that market for carbon also collapsed due to the uncertainty of what would happen next. Now, there's been a lot of debate over the relative effectiveness of CDM. One example of this has been whether the clean development mechanism essentially enabled northern countries to continue to pollute by paying for what seemed to be mitigation projects in the south, but actually in the end were not reducing emissions overall. This discussion also fits into broader questions about what types of vision for society and future economic forms are being discussed under climate change mitigation plans. So especially this has been associated with the concept of the green economy, or for the academic approach, it would be called ecological modernization. So this is a relatively reformist approach that has been questioned by some who would say that it doesn't entail the more fundamental and more challenging economic, social, and cultural changes that would be required to really address the challenge of climate change. The second approach towards climate change is climate change adaptation, which essentially asks how can existing societies or communities or families adapt to the changes that seemingly will inevitably occur due to climate change to date. Climate change adaptation has progressively become a part of national development agendas, as well as becoming incorporated into international aid regimes. Through a political ecology lens, one particular issue that is raised is the way that expert knowledge is defining what adaptation is and what are the appropriate development responses. So this has been termed rendering technical, and the risk of rendering technical is that it depoliticizes the issue of adaptation, which in fact is inherently political because it raises questions of who in particular in society is likely to bear the risks associated with adaptation strategies. Moreover, it's widely recognized that many of the groups that are most vulnerable to climate change have not been responsible for creating climate change itself. Another perspective on adaptation through a lens of political ecology is that by normalizing adaptation as an appropriate response, it downplays the imperative to really ask questions of a deeper political economic transformation to mitigate climate change that might seem to be necessary rather than just to adapt to the changes that will otherwise occur. In relation to migration, migration is increasingly recognized as an adaptation strategy. And there are different ways of thinking about this that we will discuss in the remainder of the session. Firstly, migration as an adaptation strategy could be seen as an example of individual or household agency to respond to changing circumstances. But on the other hand, this emphasis on the responsibility of the individual also risks downplaying the duty of the state to protect livelihoods and protect human rights. And so therefore, it could also be seen as a source of injustice to overly focus on migration as an adaptation strategy.